in that race. Suhas has been in the Virginia legislature for a number of years, and this is his first run of Congress. And so congratulations to Suhas Subramaniam. And in the meantime, before and we will hopefully hear from him soon, we're joined by another gentleman we've had on a number of occasions, especially here on election night, to give us breakdowns about all this data. And we have just data right here at our fingertips this year. But the master of all this is none other than Karthick Ramakrishnan, who is the founder of AAPI Data, sporting the Silicon Valley vest for us as well. That's a good look. I guess you've gone big tech on us now that you have an association with UC Berkeley. It's a good look, Karthick. Great to see you again. Another man hobnobbing at the White House, hanging out with all of his contemporaries. Karthick, I mean, you've had some fascinating data that we have been leveraging to create content around. So I really appreciate your contributions to helping inform the electorate and the public. Give us your thoughts on this night. Obviously, Vice President Harris locked in a very contentious battle with former President Trump. We're still uncertain about where things are going, but obviously there's a trend here. What are you seeing? I mean, based on the data that you're seeing, can you make a call about where this is going?
I'd say that this election looks a lot more favorable for Trump than we thought, a week or two ago. And one of the big questions was when, seeing the polls tightening, people weren't sure if that was real or, maybe just doubts about whether the weighting on the polls were overweighting, Trump's support from 2020 and taking into account their models. So, I mean, Trump is performing better than expected. Oh, you can also say that Harris is not performing as strongly as Biden performed in many of these states, like Virginia, for example, right? The fact that it's much closer than it was in 2020. Um, I think it's surprising to a lot of people. But one thing we should keep in mind is that Biden was not doing well at all. I mean, this would have been a bloodbath on the Democratic side. So by that standard, Harris, by having it very close, potentially still could pull it off within a 90-day sprint. It's still pretty remarkable, but still, it's the economy seems to have been a very big factor, especially with inflation. It's something that everyday people feel, right? Even more so than say something like unemployment, because if you're employed or unemployed, you feel the pinch of inflation. If you're retired or not retired, you feel that pinch. So that was a really tough hill to climb. Abortion is something that she benefited from, especially in terms of getting a lot of support among women, especially college-educated women. But Trump is doing better than many people expected, no doubt. And this election could drag on for days, or it could be, if it drags on for days, I think Harris has an advantage because it's the absentee votes, it's the overseas votes, and it's the urban votes that'll put her over the top, and those ballots will take longer to count. But if it gets called tomorrow, it's quite possible that Trump wins this thing. So it's fascinating. It's humbling for all of us who try to predict as much as we can. But ultimately, these things are all within margins of error when you look at the polling, what the polling suggests, and what the electoral college vote ultimately ends up being.
Well, take us back to the summertime because you had a pretty staggering bit of data that I think we picked up on, but not a whole lot of folks picked up on the fact that President Biden had lost so much support from the Indian American community, and we had a long conversation about it, just a few weeks ago, and how Vice President Harris had pulled that support and brought it all the way back up, and actually was ahead of where President Biden was 4 years ago with the Indian American community, but. It was pretty startling to see that he had lost so much support, and the Democratic Party almost 30 points from where Hillary Clinton was 8 years ago. I mean, when you have conversations, and I know you talk to a lot of folks in the know politically, when they look at your data, I mean, are they assessing that they need to change things policy wise, or they think this is just the way the pendulum is? I mean, tell me what they do with this data when they see, wait a second. How did we lose 30 points from the Indian American community that was like rock solid blew. And now there's a lot of people in play, and also speak to the male female quotient, because we did talk about the gender gap a few weeks ago. And I think that's a huge story that has still been largely underplayed. And especially when it comes to like the Indian American quotient. I've talked to a lot of Indian American men in recent weeks, and a lot of them have told me they're voting for President Trump.
Yeah, the gender gap is showing up in a couple of ways, right? So, um, Biden, first of all, Biden lost a lot of support among Indian Americans. Partly, I think it's the performance on the economy. But one question we didn't precisely ask about, but in hindsight, and especially post debate, you see just a general assessment of whether he is strong enough and capable enough, to be able to do the job. No one, no pollster asked those kinds of questions, whether he was mentally fit or sharp enough to be able to execute on the office. But we saw in the debate that that was a huge issue. But there was a sense that Biden was not as capable over time as he might have been. What we saw between our spring poll and our September poll is that Harris did improve among men, but she did not improve nearly as much as she did among women. So she really indexed very high among Indian American women. And so, there are a couple of factors at play. One is abortion politics and gender representation. Both of those things play a role, and they played a much bigger role for women than for male voters. Um, but some of the things we've been hearing over the last month, is the kinds of investments that the Trump campaign and the conservative movement more generally has been making with young men, especially through social media, through influencers. And these aren't just right wing influencers, right? These are influencers in terms of lifestyle, in terms of bodybuilders, people who are in the entertainment industry of a different type. And so that's something that I think the Democrats lost sight of over the last several years is young men and what it takes to reach out to them. But of course, it's not just about politics, it's also about the economy and how it's doing. And a lot of people feel precarious. So all of these factors, combine to play into what we see. Um, so, I mean, but I think, let's see how this all turns out. It'll be fascinating to see. I'll be looking, for example, at Michigan. People look to the Arab American vote, but if you look at the Asian American vote there too, to what extent was there a pattern of people leaving the presidential vote blank, but then voting on down ballot because of registering a protest? Well, that's an interesting political choice to make, because it's not clear if they're going to get a better result if you wanted to see more humanitarian approach towards Palestine, to have Trump in the White House. So this is really fascinating stuff. It's We think of politics as rational, but there's feelings involved. There are and there are also certain kind of litmus test issues or deal breaker issues for certain people that overall might not make a huge difference. But if you're talking about elections that have a 1 to 2 percentage point spread, they very well could be the difference between someone who's president versus someone who got defeated in the presidential election.
So Karthik, finally, before I let you go, because I appreciate you coming here on a very busy night. I mean, the data this year, did you feel like Vice President Harris was a virtual lock, given that she had this infrastructure advantage, or did you always feel like that this was going to be a rough time? Obviously, she had a very short run to the White House. She didn't have 2 years or 4 years like President Trump had. Or did something else happen here that we're just not quite quantifying?
Yeah, I think the short time frame certainly did not benefit her. On top of that, w- let's electing the first female president is always going to be a challenge. The U.S. is still the world's largest superpower. Might not be the only superpower anymore, but it's still the world's largest superpower. So, Harris, for some people, what's interesting and some of the late breaking stories about undecided voters is they weren't sure if she'd be strong on foreign policy, right? Now, if you're a Democrat, it probably doesn't make a difference. But if you truly are independent and you don't know anything about her, and the only news stories you hear is that she's supposed to be the border czar, and the border has been broken under her watch and Biden's watch, that doesn't inspire a lot of confidence. So I think even if she had a longer runway, um, it's a much higher barrier for the presidency. We've had plenty of female senators, we've had many female governors, but to be the president of the world's largest superpower, I think is still a barrier in many people's minds. And it's not just white male voters; it's other voters too who might not fully come to terms with that. Now, with Hillary Clinton, she served as Secretary of State, but the Benghazi hearings and that controversy certainly took her down a few pegs. So that was not seen as a source of strength. And for Harris, there didn't seem to be much of a kind of foreign policy experience. But I would say the biggest thing is the economy, and it's interesting, right? I mean, you see this throughout the world. Incumbent parties this year, by and large, lost, and in some cases, lost pretty dramatically. So it is really difficult for these countries that are still limping their way out of the pandemic and the economic downturn for incumbent parties to do well. And so that's ultimately the headwinds that Harris faced, even if she had a longer runway for this election. Any Democrat would have faced that kind of a barrier.
Well, Karthik, I always appreciate your insights. It's been fascinating to document, and I really appreciate the depth of coverage you provide. You give us a lot of context and fodder, and look forward to working with you moving forward. And congrats on coming up here to UC Berkeley here in the Bay Area. I know you love your time in SoCal, but it's great to have you here, and appreciate you joining us here on what is still a very busy election night. Thank you so much, Karthik Ramakrishnan with AAPI Data.